A child in the tall grass. When the 8-year-old girl stepped out of the Montana wilderness, barefoot, trembling, eyes too old for her face, Devlin Merrick knew his careful solitude was about to shatter. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply asked, in a voice barely louder than the wind, if he had any leftovers she might eat. For a man who'd buried his wife and 2 daughters 6 years earlier, who'd built his entire existence around not feeling, that polite question cracked something open inside his chest. He gave her his supper, his blankets, a corner of the cabin floor. And when morning came, he discovered the truth. Some children don't ask to be saved. They simply refuse to disappear. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Faye and Devlin's story travels. And if this story grabs you, hit that like button and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The cabin sat in a shallow valley where the pines grew thick and the creek ran cold even in August. Devlin Merrick had chosen the spot deliberately, far enough from Pinewood that neighbors didn't visit, close enough to town that he could trade pelts and venison when his supplies ran low. The land had no name. The cabin had no porch. There was a roof, 4 walls, a stone hearth, and a door that latched from the inside. That was enough. Devlin had lived there alone for 6 years. He rose before dawn, checked his trapline, skinned what he'd caught, salted the hides, and hung them to cure in the lean-to behind the cabin. He boiled coffee in a dented pot, fried cornbread in bear grease, ate standing at the table. He spoke to no one. He expected nothing. The routine was a kind of armor, and he wore it every day without complaint. On the evening of August 23, 1880, Devlin was scraping the last of his supper, beans and salt pork, onto a tin plate when he heard the sound, a footstep, soft, hesitant, just outside the door. He froze, fork halfway to his mouth, and listened. Another step, then silence. Devlin set the plate down slowly and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. He'd had trouble with a bear the previous spring, and twice he'd found cougar tracks near the creek. He moved to the door, thumbed back the hammer, and pulled the latch. The door swung open. Standing in the tall grass, lit by the last amber glow of sunset, was a child. A girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud. Her hair, dark brown, tangled, hung loose around thin shoulders. She wore no shoes. Her feet were scratched and filthy. Her knees scraped raw. But it was her face that stopped him cold. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even afraid. She just looked at him with dark, steady eyes, eyes that had seen too much, and said, very quietly, "Mister, do you have any leftovers I could eat?" Devlin stared at her. The rifle felt suddenly absurd in his hands. He lowered it slowly, set it back against the wall, and stepped outside. The girl didn't move. She stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of her, waiting. "Where did you come from, Seth?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder toward the forest. "The road, but I got lost." "Where's your family?" Her face didn't change. "Dead." The word hung in the air like smoke. Devlin's throat tightened. He swallowed hard and forced himself to keep his voice level. "How long you been walking?" "I don't know. A few days, maybe." "You been eating?" She shook her head. He looked down at her bare feet, the dirt caked between her toes, the scratches that ran up her calves like claw marks. He thought of his daughters, Lily and Rose, 4 and 6 when the fever took them, and felt something twist hard in his chest. "Wait here," he said. He went back inside, grabbed the plate of beans and pork, a tin cup of water, and the wool blanket from his bed. When he came back out, the girl was still standing in the same spot, as if she'd been carved from stone. He held out the plate. "This ain't leftovers. It's my supper, but it's yours now." She blinked. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She took the plate carefully, like it was made of glass, and sat down right there in the grass. She ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite as if she were trying to make it last. Devlin watched her, his chest tight, and realized she hadn't eaten in days, maybe longer. When she finished, she set the plate down and looked up at him. "Thank you, mister." "Devlin," he said. "Name's Devlin Merrick." "I'm Faye Bishop." He nodded. "You can't stay out here tonight, Faye. There's animals in these woods that'll kill you before morning." She looked toward the cabin, then back at him. I don't want to be trouble. You're already trouble, he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Come on. He led her inside, spread the blanket on the floor near the hearth, and handed her a second blanket to cover herself. She curled up without a word, pulled the blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. Devlin sat at the table, his supper forgotten, and watched the firelight flicker across her face. She was asleep in minutes. He stayed awake until the fire burned low, listening to the sound of her breathing, soft, steady, alive. Morning came cold and gray. Devlin woke to the smell of ash and damp wood, the cabin darker than usual. He sat up, scrubbed a hand over his face, and glanced toward the hearth. Faye was awake, sitting cross-legged on the blanket, hands folded in her lap. She looked at him with those same steady eyes and said, I'm sorry I took your bed. You didn't take my bed, Devlin said. You took the floor. Still, I'm sorry. He stood, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, and moved to the stove. He built up the fire, set the coffee pot to boil, and sliced thick slabs of cornbread left over from the day before. He fried them in the skillet with a little bacon grease, then handed her a plate. Eat, he said. She ate. He poured coffee for himself and sat across from her at the table, watching her chew in silence. She had good manners, didn't talk with her mouth full, didn't grab or rush. Someone had taught her that. Faye, he said quietly, you said your family's dead. You got anybody else? Aunts, uncles? Anybody? She swallowed and set her fork down. I had an aunt, but she didn't want me. Why not? She married a man last spring. He didn't like me being around. So what happened? Faye's voice was calm, but her hands tightened in her lap. He told me I could sleep in the barn, but I had to earn my keep. I tried. I really did. But one night he said I wasn't working hard enough, and he locked me out. Told me if I came back, he'd take a switch to me. Devlin's jaw tightened. So you ran? Yes, sir. How far'd you get? I made it to a farm about a day's walk from town. The man there said he'd give me work if I helped with the chickens, but she trailed off, her voice dropping. He put his hands on me, tried to pull me into the barn. I kicked him and ran. Devlin's grip on his coffee cup tightened until his knuckles went white. He forced himself to breathe, to keep his voice steady. You did the right thing. She nodded. I didn't know where else to go, so I just kept walking. I saw your smoke and thought maybe you'd have some food you didn't need. Devlin set the cup down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Faye, you can't go back to your aunt. You understand that? Yes, sir. And you sure as hell can't go back to that farm. No, sir. He rubbed a hand over his face, thinking. You got any kin in Montana? Anybody at all? She shook her head. What about back east? My daddy had a father in St. Louis, but they didn't talk. Daddy said his father didn't approve of Mama. Devlin exhaled slowly. All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here for now, just until we figure out what to do. Faye's eyes widened. You mean it? I mean it. She looked around the cabin, at the rough-hewn table, the stone hearth, the single window with its cracked pane, and something in her face softened. Thank you, Mr. Merrick. Devlin, he said. Just Devlin. What? The days that followed fell into a rhythm Devlin hadn't expected. Faye rose early, helped him stoke the fire, and learned to fry cornbread without burning it. She was small, but she was strong. She could haul water from the creek, gather kindling, and sweep the cabin floor without complaint. She didn't talk much, but she listened, and she watched everything he did with quiet intensity, as if she were memorizing it. Devlin taught her how to bait a snare, how to skin a rabbit, how to tell good firewood from bad. He showed her the trap line, explained the difference between mink and marten, and let her carry the pelts back to the cabin in a canvas sack. She never flinched, never balked. She just nodded and did the work. At night after supper, she sat by the fire and mended his shirts with needle and thread she'd found in a basket under the table. She didn't ask permission, she just did it. One evening, as she stitched a tear in his sleeve, Devlin said, You don't have to do that. I know, she said. But you let me stay, so I should help. He looked at her across the firelight and felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept locked away for 6 long years. "Faye," he said quietly, "you ain't here to work off a debt. You're here because you got nowhere else to go, and that's enough." She looked up at him, needles still in her hand, and nodded. "Okay," but she kept mending the shirt anyway. 2 weeks after Faye arrived, Devlin decided she needed proper clothes. The dress she'd been wearing was beyond saving, and the nights were getting colder. He hitched the mule to the wagon, loaded a few pelts to trade, and told Faye they were going to Pinewood. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, her bare feet dangling over the edge, and didn't say a word the entire ride. Pinewood was a rough little town, 2 streets, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. Devlin pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile and helped Faye down. Inside, the store smelled like coffee, tobacco, and leather. The shopkeeper, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Callahan, looked up from the counter and raised an eyebrow. "Devlin Merrick," she said. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Need some supplies," Devlin said, "and the girl needs clothes." Mrs. Callahan's gaze shifted to Faye, and her expression softened. "Well now, who's this?" "Faye Bishop," Devlin said. "She's staying with me for a while." Mrs. Callahan came around the counter, crouched down to Faye's level, and studied her carefully. "You need a dress, sweetheart?" Faye nodded. "And shoes?" Another nod. Mrs. Callahan straightened and looked at Devlin. "I'll take care of her. You go on and do your business." Devlin traded the pelts for credit, bought flour, sugar, salt, and a new coffee pot, then waited by the wagon while Mrs. Callahan fitted Faye with a simple cotton dress, a wool coat, and a pair of sturdy boots. When they came outside, Faye was dressed head to toe in brown and gray, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She looked almost like a different child. "Thank you," Faye said to Mrs. Callahan. "You're welcome, honey." Mrs. Callahan glanced at Devlin. "She's a sweet girl. You take good care of her." "I will," Devlin said. They were about to leave when a man stepped out of the saloon across the street, a tall, barrel-chested man with a graying beard and cold blue eyes. He saw Faye and stopped dead. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said. "That's her." Devlin's hand moved instinctively to the knife on his belt. "Who the hell are you?" The man crossed the street, his boots heavy on the dirt. "Name's Curtis Webb. I'm married to Faye's aunt." Faye shrank back against the wagon. Devlin stepped in front of her. "She ain't going with you." Curtis laughed, a low, ugly sound. "She sure as hell is. She ran off without permission. That makes her a runaway, and I got every right to bring her home." "She ran because you threw her out," Devlin said, his voice hard. "Don't pretend otherwise." Curtis's smile faded. "You don't know a damn thing about it." "I know enough." Curtis looked past Devlin, straight at Faye. "Get in the wagon, girl. We're leaving." Faye didn't move. "I said get in the wagon." Devlin drew the knife, just an inch, just enough to catch the light, and said very quietly, "Touch her, and I'll gut you where you stand." Curtis's eyes narrowed. "You threatening me?" "I'm making a promise." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Curtis spat into the dust and took a step back. "You keep her then," he said, "but don't come crying when she brings you nothing but trouble." He turned and walked back toward the saloon. Devlin watched him go, his heart pounding, then looked down at Faye. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Good. Get in the wagon." They rode home in silence. Bob. That night, after supper, Devlin sat at the table with a piece of paper, a pencil, and a decision he didn't want to make. Faye was curled up by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching him. "Faye," he said, "I need to ask you something." She sat up. "Yes, sir?" "If I could make it so Curtis Webb can't take you, if I could make it legal that you stay here, would you want that?" Her eyes widened. "You mean forever?" "I mean as long as you need. Maybe longer." She stared at him, her lips parted, and then she nodded so hard the blanket slipped from her shoulders. "Yes, please." Devlin exhaled slowly. "All right. Then I'm going to talk to a lawyer in Helena, see what it takes to make you my ward." "What's a ward?" "Means I'd be responsible for you, Legally, like a parent. Faye's voice was barely a whisper. You do that? I do that. She stood, crossed the cabin, and wrapped her arms around his waist. She didn't cry. She just held on, her head pressed against his ribs, her small body trembling. Devlin closed his eyes and rested a hand on her head. You're safe now, he said quietly. I promise. And for the first time in 6 years, he meant it. The ride back from Pinewood had been silent, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence Devlin had grown accustomed to over the years. This was the silence of fear barely held in check, of a child trying not to show how badly she'd been shaken. Faye sat beside him on the wagon seat, her new boots pressed together, her hands twisted in the fabric of her new dress. She stared straight ahead at the road, but Devlin could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched every time a branch snapped in the woods. When they reached the cabin, she climbed down without a word and went inside. Devlin unhitched the mule, led it to the small corral behind the lean-to, and stood there longer than necessary, one hand on the animal's neck, trying to settle the rage still burning in his chest. Curtis Webb's face. That smug, ugly smile. The way he'd looked at Faye like she was property he'd misplaced. Devlin had killed men during the war, men who'd been trying to kill him first. He'd done it without hesitation, without regret. But standing in that dusty street in Pinewood, knife half drawn, he'd wanted to kill Curtis Webb for an entirely different reason. Not survival. Justice. He took a long breath, let it out slowly, and went inside. Faye was sitting on her pallet by the fire, still wearing her coat, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wide and watchful. You hungry? Devlin asked. She shook her head. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and crossed to the hearth. He added wood to the fire, stirred the coals, and let the warmth spread through the cabin before he spoke again. Faye, I need you to listen to me. She nodded. What happened today? Curtis showing up like that? It's going to happen again. Maybe not him, but somebody. The law don't care much about what's right when it comes to kids. They care about who's got the legal claim. And right now, your aunt's still your kin, which means Curtis can make noise if he wants to. Faye's voice was small. Are you going to send me back? No. The word came out harder than he intended, and he softened his tone. No, Faye, I'm not. But if we're going to keep you safe, we got to do this the right way. That means I go to Helena, talk to a lawyer, and file the papers to become your legal guardian. It ain't fast and it ain't cheap, but it's the only way to make sure nobody can take you. She looked down at her hands. What if the lawyer says no? Then I'll find another lawyer. What if they all say no? Devlin crouched down in front of her, his voice quiet but firm. Faye, I made you a promise. I don't break promises. You understand? She met his eyes, searching his face, and then nodded. Good. He stood and moved to the table. Now, I'm going to make some supper, and you're going to eat it, and then we're both going to get some sleep. Tomorrow I'll start figuring out what we need to do. Faye didn't argue. She ate the cornbread and beans he put in front of her, washed it down with water, and curled up on her pallet without another word. Devlin sat at the table long after the fire burned low, the pencil in his hand, the blank paper in front of him, and tried to think of what to write in a letter he had no idea how to begin. He'd never been a man of words. He'd lived by action, by routine, by the things he could see and touch and fix with his hands. But this required something different. This required navigating a system he didn't understand, in a world that didn't care about intentions. Finally, he set the pencil down and went to bed. The answer would come in the morning. It always did. 3 days later, Devlin saddled the mule and made the long ride to Helena. He left Faye at the cabin with strict instructions to keep the door latched, the rifle loaded, and the fire going. She'd nodded solemnly, and he'd seen the flicker of fear in her eyes, but she hadn't argued. Helena was bigger than Pinewood, busier, louder, full of miners and merchants and men looking to get rich or die trying. Devlin had been there twice before, both times to sell furs, and he'd hated it both times. Too many people, too much noise. But today he had a purpose, and that made it easier to stomach. He found the law office on a narrow side street above a dry goods store. The sign out front read Malcolm Reeves, attorney at law. Devlin tied the mule to the post, climbed the stairs, and knocked. A voice called from inside. "It's open!" Devlin pushed the door and stepped into a cramped office that smelled like pipe smoke and old paper. The man behind the desk was younger than Devlin had expected, maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and sharp eyes that didn't miss much. He looked up from a stack of documents and raised an eyebrow. "Help you?" "I need a lawyer," Devlin said. "You found one. Malcolm Reeves." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Devlin sat. Reeves leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "What's the trouble?" "I got a girl staying with me. 8 years old, orphan. Her aunt don't want her, but her aunt's husband tried to take her back anyway. I need to make sure he can't." Reeves's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "You related to this girl?" "No." "You married to the aunt?" "No." "Then what's your legal standing?" "I don't have one. That's why I'm here." Reeves pulled a piece of paper from the stack, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and started writing. "Name?" "Devlin Merrick." "The girl's name?" "Faye Bishop." "Parents deceased?" "Yes." "Any other living relatives besides the aunt?" Devlin hesitated. "Her father had a father. Lives in St. Louis, but they didn't talk." Reeves stopped writing and looked up. "St. Louis? You know his name." "Faye mentioned it once. Ashby, I think. Nathaniel Ashby." Reeves set the pen down slowly. "Nathaniel Ashby. The railroad man?" Devlin frowned. "I don't know. Why?" "Because if it's the same Nathaniel Ashby I'm thinking of, he's one of the richest men west of the Mississippi, owns half the rail lines in Missouri." Reeves leaned forward, his voice careful. "You sure the girl's father didn't talk to him?" "That's what she said. Her father married a woman Ashby didn't approve of, and they cut ties." Reeves exhaled slowly and picked up the pen again. "All right, here's the situation. If you want to become the girl's legal guardian, you'll need to file a petition with the territorial court. We'll need affidavits from people who can vouch for your character, proof that the girl's current living situation is unsafe, and a statement from the girl herself saying she wants to stay with you. How long does that take? Couple of months? Maybe longer. Depends on the judge." Devlin's jaw tightened. "What happens in the meantime?" "In the meantime, the aunt, or anyone else with a legal claim, can petition for custody. And if this Nathaniel Ashby gets wind of the situation, he could file a claim too." "Even though he never gave a damn about the girl before?" "Doesn't matter. Blood is blood, and the law favors blood." Reeves tapped the pen against the desk. "But here's the thing. If we can prove that the girl is better off with you, if we can show the court that you're providing a stable home, that the aunt's husband is unfit, and that the girl herself wants to stay, then we've got a shot." Devlin leaned forward, his voice low. "What do I need to do?" Reeves smiled faintly. "First, you pay me $50. Then you go back to that cabin, take care of that girl, and start gathering witnesses. I'll handle the paperwork." Devlin reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and counted out $50 in coins and bills. He set it on the desk. Reeves swept it into a drawer and stood, extending his hand. "We'll get this done, Mr. Merrick, one way or another." Devlin shook his hand and left. By the time Devlin returned to the cabin, the sun was setting and the air had turned cold. He found Faye sitting by the fire, the rifle across her lap, her face pale but determined. When he opened the door, she jumped to her feet. "You're back." "I'm back." He hung his coat and hat, crossed to the hearth, and crouched down beside her. "Everything all right?" She nodded. "Nobody came." "Good." He took the rifle gently from her hands and set it against the wall. "I talked to a lawyer. His name's Malcolm Reeves. He's going to help us." Faye's eyes widened. "He is?" "He is, but it's going to take time, and we're going to need people in Pinewood to say good things about me. You think Mrs. Callahan would do that?" "I think so. She was real nice." "All right, I'll talk to her next time we're in town." He paused, then added, "Faye, there's something else. The lawyer asked about your grandfather, the one in St. Louis." Faye's face went still. "What about him?" "He thinks your grandfather might be somebody important, somebody with money." "Daddy never talked about him much. Just said they didn't get along." "You ever meet him?" She shook her head. No, Mama said he didn't want to know us. Devlin nodded slowly. Well, if he didn't want to know you before, he probably won't want to know you now. But the lawyer said we should be ready, just in case. Faye looked down at her hands. I don't want to go to St. Louis. You're not going to St. Louis. Promise? Promise. She exhaled and leaned against his shoulder. Devlin hesitated, then wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling between them, the darkness pressing in from outside. Check. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Devlin kept up his trapline, Faye kept up the cabin, and together they settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. She learned to make coffee the way he liked it, strong enough to strip paint, and he learned that she had a habit of humming while she worked, soft little tunes she'd probably learned from her mother. One afternoon, as they sat on the cabin steps shelling beans, Faye said, Devlin? Yeah? Did you have a family before? He went still, the bean pod frozen in his hand. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he set the pod down and looked out at the trees. I did, he said quietly. A wife. 2 daughters. Faye's voice was careful. What happened to them? Fever. 6 years ago. Took all 3 of them in less than a week. I'm sorry. He nodded. Me too. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft plop of beans dropping into the bowl. What were their names? Faye asked. My wife was Catherine. My girls were Lily and Rose. Faye smiled faintly. Those are pretty names. They were pretty girls. He glanced at her. You remind me of Lily. She was stubborn too. Faye's smile widened. I'm not stubborn. You argued with a man twice your size over a plate of beans. That's stubborn. She laughed, a real laugh, bright and sudden, and Devlin felt something warm unfold in his chest. He'd forgotten what that sound felt like. A week later, they rode into Pinewood again. This time Devlin had a list of names, people Reeves had suggested he talk to, people who might be willing to vouch for him in court. Mrs. Callahan was first on the list. They found her in the mercantile, restocking shelves. She smiled when she saw Faye and came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Well now, look at you, growing like a weed. Faye ducked her head, shy. Devlin cleared his throat. Mrs. Callahan, I need to ask you something. She looked at him, her expression sharpening. Go on. I'm trying to become Faye's legal guardian. My lawyer says I need people who can vouch for me, people who know I'm taking good care of her. Mrs. Callahan's gaze softened. You want me to write a letter? If you're willing. She looked down at Faye, then back at Devlin. I'll do better than that. I'll testify in court if I have to. Devlin exhaled. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing right by her. They left the mercantile and moved on to the blacksmith, then the pastor, then the postmaster. By the end of the day, Devlin had 4 people willing to speak on his behalf, and Faye had a peppermint stick from the general store. On the ride home, she sat beside him, sucking on the candy, her feet swinging. Devlin? She said. Yeah? I think this is going to work. He looked at her, at the hope shining in her eyes, and nodded. Yeah, Faye, I think so too. But deep down, in the part of him that had learned not to trust hope, he wondered if he was lying. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Devlin was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. He set the axe down, wiped the sweat from his face, and walked around to the front of the cabin just as a rider pulled up. A young man in a dusty coat, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Devlin Merrick? The man asked. That's me. The man reached into the satchel and pulled out an envelope. Telegram from Helena. Mr. Reeves asked me to deliver it. Devlin took the envelope, his chest tightening. Thanks. The man tipped his hat and rode off. Devlin stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope, then went inside. Faye was at the table mending a shirt. She looked up, saw his face, and set the needle down. What is it? Letter from the lawyer. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the lines once, then again, and the words hit him like a fist to the gut. Mr. Merrick, we have a problem. Nathaniel Ashby has been notified of his granddaughter's existence. He has filed a petition for full custody, citing his legal rights as the child's closest living relative. A hearing has been scheduled for October 15th in Helena. You are required to appear with the child. I will do everything I can, but you need to understand, Ashby has money, influence, and the law on his side. This fight just got a lot harder. Reeves Devlin's hands shook. He set the letter down carefully, his jaw tight, and looked at Faye. She was staring at him, her face pale. What does it say? He took a breath. Your grandfather found out about you. He wants custody. Faye stood so fast the chair fell backward. No, I don't want to go. You're not going. But the letter. I don't care what the letter says. Devlin crossed to her, gripped her shoulders gently. Faye, listen to me. We're going to fight this. We're going to go to that hearing, and we're going to tell the judge the truth. And if the judge don't listen, then we'll find another way. But you are not going to St. Louis. I swear it. She threw her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest, her body shaking. He held her tight, his eyes burning, and made a silent vow. Nathaniel Ashby could have all the money in the world. It wouldn't be enough. Well, the days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur. Devlin rode to Helena twice more, meeting with Reeves, going over testimony, preparing every argument they could think of. Reeves was thorough, methodical, but Devlin could see the worry in his eyes. Ashby's sending his own lawyer, Reeves said during their last meeting. Man named Whitmore. He's good, real good. And he's going to argue that a wealthy, established man can provide better for the girl than a trapper living alone in the woods. I'm not just a trapper, Devlin said. I'm the man who took her in when nobody else would. I know, but the law don't always care about that. Devlin's voice was low, hard. Then we make them care. Reeves nodded. We'll try. On the morning of October 14th, Devlin and Faye loaded the wagon and started the long journey to Helena. Faye was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her face set in that same stoic expression she'd worn the night she'd walked out of the woods. Devlin didn't push her to talk. He just drove, the reins loose in his hands, his mind turning over every possible outcome. They reached Helena late in the afternoon and checked into a small boarding house near the courthouse. Faye barely touched her supper. Devlin didn't eat at all. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed in their rented room, Faye said, Devlin? Yeah? If the judge says I have to go, will you come get me? He looked at her across the dim room, her small face half hidden in shadow, and felt something break inside him. Faye, he said quietly, if the judge says you have to go, I'll tear down heaven and hell to bring you back. You hear me? She nodded, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Now get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we fight. She closed her eyes. Devlin sat in the chair by the window and watched the stars until dawn broke over the city. The Helena Courthouse was a 2-story brick building that sat at the end of Main Street like a monument to order in a town built on chaos and gold. Devlin had passed it before, but he'd never been inside. Now, standing at the base of the stone steps with Faye's hand gripped tight in his, he felt the weight of the place pressing down on him. All that marble and wood, and the cold certainty of men who believed the law was something fixed and knowable. Faye looked up at the building, her face pale, and Devlin felt her fingers tighten around his. It's all right, he said quietly. We're just going to tell the truth. That's all we can do. She nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes. They climbed the steps together and pushed through the heavy double doors into a dim hallway that smelled like old paper and tobacco. Malcolm Reeves was waiting for them near the courtroom entrance, his coat buttoned, his expression grim. You ready? Reeves asked. Devlin's jaw tightened. As I'll ever be. Reeves glanced down at Faye. And you, young lady? You remember what we talked about? Faye nodded. Tell the truth. Don't be scared. That's right. Reeves's voice softened. And remember, the judge is just a man. He puts his trousers on one leg at a time, same as anybody else. Faye almost smiled at that. Reeves pushed open the courtroom door and led them inside. The room was smaller than Devlin had expected. Wooden benches arranged in rows, a raised platform at the front where the judge would sit, and a table on each side for the lawyers. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, cutting sharp angles across the floor. A handful of people sat scattered in the gallery, witnesses, clerks, a reporter with a notebook balanced on his knee. And at the front, seated at the opposing table, was a man Devlin had never seen but recognized instantly. He was tall, lean, dressed in a fine wool suit that probably cost more than Devlin made in a year. His hair was silver, swept back from a sharp, angular face, and his eyes were the same dark brown as Faye's. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, and when he saw Faye, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. It was gone too quickly to tell. Beside him sat another man, younger, slick-haired, with a kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Whitmore, Devlin guessed. The lawyer. Reeves led Devlin and Faye to their table and gestured for them to sit. Faye slid into the chair beside Devlin, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Devlin leaned close and whispered, "That him? Your grandfather?" She glanced up, looked across the room, and nodded once. "You ever seen a picture of him?" "No, but Daddy had the same eyes." Devlin looked at Nathaniel Ashby again and felt a cold anger settle in his chest. This man, who'd cut his own son out of his life, who'd never once reached out to see if his granddaughter was alive or dead, now sat here in his expensive suit, ready to claim her like a piece of lost property. The door behind the judge's bench opened and a clerk stepped out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Hale." The room stood. Judge Hale entered, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with gray mutton chops and a face carved from stone. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked out over the courtroom. "Be seated," he said. Everyone sat. Hale opened a folder on his desk, scanned the top page, and looked up. "This is a petition for guardianship in the matter of Faye Bishop, minor child. Mr. Reeves, you're representing Mr. Devlin Merrick. Mr. Whitmore, you're representing Mr. Nathaniel Ashby. Is that correct?" Both lawyers stood. "Yes, Your Honor," Reeves said. "Correct, Your Honor," Whitmore added. Hale nodded. "Very well. Mr. Whitmore, your client filed the petition. You may begin." Whitmore stood, buttoned his coat, and stepped to the center of the room. He moved like a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Smooth, confident, utterly at ease. "Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Mr. Nathaniel Ashby, is the paternal grandfather of Faye Bishop. He is a man of considerable means and standing, with estates in St. Louis and Kansas City. He has recently learned of his granddaughter's existence and has come forward to fulfill his legal and moral obligation to provide for her care." Hale looked at Ashby. "Mr. Ashby, when did you first learn of the child's existence?" Ashby stood, his voice calm and measured. 3 weeks ago, Your Honor. I had not been in contact with my son for many years. When I learned that he had passed and that his daughter was living in uncertain circumstances, I felt it was my duty to intervene." "And why were you not in contact with your son?" Ashby's expression didn't change. "We had a disagreement about his choice of spouse. I now regret that disagreement deeply." Hale nodded and made a note. "Proceed, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore smiled. "Your Honor, the law is clear. Blood relatives have priority in matters of guardianship, particularly when they are capable of providing a stable and prosperous home. Mr. Ashby can offer his granddaughter the finest education, the best medical care, and a life of comfort and security. He can give her opportunities that a rural trapper, however well-meaning, simply cannot provide." Devlin's fists clenched under the table. Whitmore continued, "Mr. Merrick has no legal relationship to the child. He is not her father, not her uncle, not even a distant cousin. He is, by his own admission, a stranger who took the child in under informal circumstances. While we commend his kindness, kindness is not a substitute for legal guardianship. The child belongs with her family." Hale looked at Reeves. "Mr. Reeves, your response?" Reeves stood and walked to the center of the room. He didn't smile, he didn't perform. He just spoke, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore is correct that blood relatives have priority under the law. But the law also requires the court to consider the best interests of the child. And in this case, the best interests of Faye Bishop are not served by sending her to live with a man she has never met, in a city she has never seen, to be raised by servants and tutors instead of family." He paused, letting the words settle. "Faye Bishop's parents are dead. Her aunt married a man who threw her out of the house and told her not to come back. She wandered alone in the wilderness for days, hungry and afraid, until she found Mr. Merrick's cabin. And Mr. Merrick didn't turn her away. He fed her. He clothed her. He gave her a home, not because the law required it, but because it was the right thing to do. Reeves turned to look at Devlin, then back at the judge. Your Honor, I have affidavits from 4 residents of Pinewood, the town nearest to Mr. Merrick's home, all of whom attest to his character and his care for the child. I have a statement from the child herself, saying she wishes to remain with Mr. Merrick. And I have the simple truth that for the past 2 months, Mr. Merrick has been the only family Fay Bishop has known. Hale leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. Mr. Whitmore, does your client dispute any of these facts? Whitmore stood again. We do not dispute that Mr. Merrick has provided temporary care for the child, but temporary care is not the same as permanent guardianship. The fact remains that Mr. Ashby is the child's grandfather. He has the legal right and the moral obligation to raise her. Hale looked down at Fay. Miss Bishop, would you stand, please? Fay's eyes went wide. She looked at Devlin, who nodded, and then she stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table. How old are you, Miss Bishop? Hale asked. 8, sir. Do you understand why you're here today? Yes, sir. My grandfather wants me to live with him. And do you want to live with your grandfather? Fay's voice was small but clear. No, sir. Hale's expression didn't change. Why not? Fay looked at Devlin, then back at the judge. Because I don't know him. And he didn't know me when my mama and daddy were alive. He didn't come to their funeral. He didn't write letters. He didn't care. But Devlin cares. He gave me a home. He keeps me safe. He's teaching me things. And I want to stay with him. The courtroom was silent. Hale studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You may sit. Fay sat, her hands shaking. Hale turned to Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any witnesses you'd like to call? Just one, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mr. Nathaniel Ashby to the stand. Ashby stood and walked to the witness chair. The clerk swore him in, and he sat, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. Whitmore approached him. Mr. Ashby, can you tell the court why you wish to have custody of your granddaughter? Ashby's voice was measured, almost gentle. Because she is the only family I have left. My son is gone. My wife passed many years ago. Fay is my blood, and I owe it to her and to her father to give her the life she deserves. And what kind of life can you offer her? A life of education, culture, opportunity. She will attend the finest schools. She will want for nothing. She will grow up knowing that she is loved and valued. Whitmore nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Hale looked at Reeves. Your witness, Mr. Reeves. Reeves stood and walked slowly toward the witness stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He just looked at Ashby and said, Mr. Ashby, when did your son die? 2 years ago. Influenza, I believe. And when did you learn of his death? Ashby hesitated. Approximately 6 months later. 6 months. And in those 6 months, did you make any attempt to locate his widow or his child? I did not know he had a child. But you knew he had a widow. Ashby's jaw tightened. I assumed she had returned to her own family. You assumed, but you didn't check. No. Reeves let that sit for a moment, then continued. Mr. Ashby, you said you and your son had a disagreement about his choice of spouse. What was the nature of that disagreement? I felt the marriage was imprudent. She came from a background I did not approve of. What background was that? She was the daughter of a school teacher. She had no wealth, no connections. So you disapproved because she was poor. Ashby's voice hardened. I disapproved because I believed my son was making a mistake. And when he married her anyway, you cut him off. I did. You disowned him. Yes. Oh, Reeves nodded slowly. And now, 2 years after his death, you've decided that his daughter, the child you never acknowledged, never wrote to, never visited, should come live with you. Why now, Mr. Ashby? Ashby's eyes flashed. Because I made a mistake. I was too proud, too stubborn, and I lost my son because of it. I cannot undo that, but I can do right by his daughter. Or, Reeves said quietly, you could be doing this for another reason entirely. Tell me, Mr. Ashby, do you have any other heirs? Whitmore stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Hale looked at Reeves. Mr. Reeves, where are you going with this? I'm establishing motive, Your Honor. Hale nodded. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Ashby. Ashby's voice was cold. No. I have no other heirs. So if you were to die without an heir, your estate would be divided among various charities and distant relatives. Is that correct? That is correct. But if you were to gain custody of your granddaughter, she would inherit everything. Isn't that right? Ashby's face went pale. That is not why. It's a simple question, Mr. Ashby. If Fay Bishop becomes your ward, she inherits your estate, yes or no? Yes, but no further questions. Reeves returned to his seat. Hale looked at Whitmore. Redirect? Whitmore stood, his expression tight. Mr. Ashby, regardless of inheritance, do you love your granddaughter? Ashby's voice was quiet. I do. Or I want to. I want the chance to know her. Thank you. No further questions. Hale made another note, then looked at Reeves. Mr. Reeves, do you have any witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Devlin Merrick to the stand. Devlin stood, his heart pounding, and walked to the witness chair. The clerk swore him in, and he sat, his hands gripping the armrests. Reeves approached him. Mr. Merrick, how did you meet Fay Bishop? Devlin's voice was rough but steady. She walked out of the woods one night and asked if I had any leftovers. I gave her my supper and let her sleep by the fire. Did you know who she was? Not at first. She told me her name and that her folks were dead, said her aunt didn't want her, and her step-uncle threw her out. And what did you do? I let her stay. Why? Devlin looked at Fay, then back at Reeves. Because she needed help, and because I knew what it was like to lose everything. Can you explain that? Devlin's throat tightened. I had a wife and 2 daughters. They died of fever 6 years ago. I've been alone ever since. When Fay showed up, I didn't plan on taking her in, but she reminded me of my eldest girl, and I couldn't turn her away. What have the past 2 months been like? Hard. Good. She works. She listens. She's smart. She don't complain, and she's got more courage than most grown men I've known. Do you love her, Mr. Merrick? Devlin's voice cracked. Yes, I do. Reeves nodded. No further questions. Whitmore stood and approached the witness stand, his expression sharp. Mr. Merrick, you said you live alone in the wilderness, is that correct? Yes. And you make your living as a trapper. That's right. How much money do you make in a year? Devlin's jaw tightened. Enough to get by. Can you give me a number? Maybe $300-400? Whitmore's eyebrows rose. $300 or $400. And you believe that's sufficient to raise a child? I've kept her fed, clothed, and safe. That's more than her aunt did. But can you send her to school? Can you afford a doctor if she gets sick? Can you give her the opportunities Mr. Ashby can provide? Devlin leaned forward, his voice low and hard. I can give her a home. I can give her someone who gives a damn whether she lives or dies. Can Mr. Ashby say the same? Whitmore's smile was cold. Mr. Merrick, isn't it true that you have no legal right to this child? That you are, in fact, a stranger who took her in under questionable circumstances? I took her in because nobody else would. And yet, you're asking this court to grant you custody over her own flesh and blood. I'm asking this court to do what's right. No further questions. Devlin stood and returned to his seat. His hands were shaking. Hale looked at both lawyers. Anything else? Reeves stood. Your Honor, I'd like to call Fay Bishop to the stand. Hale's expression softened. Miss Bishop, please come forward. Fay stood and walked to the witness chair. She was so small that her feet barely touched the floor. The clerk swore her in, and she sat, her hands folded in her lap. Reeves approached her gently. Fay, I'm going to ask you some questions. You just tell the truth, all right? She nodded. Do you remember the night you met Mr. Merrick? Yes, sir. Can you tell the court what happened? Fay's voice was quiet but clear. I was hungry. I'd been walking for days. I saw smoke from his chimney and thought maybe he'd have food he didn't need, so I knocked on his door. What did he do? He gave me a supper and a blanket, and he let me sleep inside. Did he ask for anything in return? No, sir. And the next morning? He made me breakfast, and he asked me where I came from. I told him my parents were dead and my aunt didn't want me. What did he say? He said I could stay, just until we figured out what to do. And has he kept you safe? Yes, sir. Has he been kind to you? Yes, sir. Reeves crouched down so he was at her level. Faye, if the judge says you have to go live with your grandfather, how would you feel? Faye's voice broke. Scared. Why? Because I don't know him, and I don't want to leave Devlin. Why not? Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because he's my family now. Reeves stood and looked at the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Whitmore approached the stand. Miss Bishop, do you understand that your grandfather can give you a better life than Mr. Merrick? Faye's voice was small. I don't want a better life. I want to go home. Whitmore's expression hardened. And where is home, Miss Bishop? With Devlin. No further questions. Hale looked at Faye and said gently, You may step down, Miss Bishop. Faye returned to her seat, her face wet with tears. Devlin wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close. Hale looked at both lawyers. Closing arguments. Mr. Whitmore, you may begin. Whitmore stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, this case is not complicated. The law is clear. Blood relatives have priority in guardianship cases, and Mr. Nathaniel Ashby is the child's grandfather. He is a man of means, of character, of standing. He can provide for Faye Bishop in ways that Mr. Merrick simply cannot. The child's preference is understandable. Mr. Merrick has been kind to her. But a child's preference is not sufficient grounds to override the law. We ask the court to grant custody to Mr. Ashby. Hale nodded. Mr. Reeves. Reeves stood. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore says the law is clear, but the law also says the court must act in the best interests of the child. And Faye Bishop's best interests are not served by sending her to live with a stranger in a strange city. Mr. Ashby had years to reach out to his son. He didn't. He had months to search for his granddaughter after his son's death. He didn't. He only came forward when it became convenient, when it became profitable. This is not about love. This is about control. We ask the court to grant guardianship to Mr. Merrick, the man who has been Faye's true family for the past 2 months. Hale leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I'm going to take this matter under advisement. I'll issue a ruling within the week. In the meantime, Miss Bishop will remain in Mr. Merrick's care. Court is adjourned. He stood and left the room. Devlin exhaled and looked down at Faye. She was staring at her hands, tears still streaming down her face. What does that mean? She whispered. It means we wait, Devlin said, and we hope. But as he looked across the room at Nathaniel Ashby, still seated, still composed, still watching, he wondered if hope would be enough. They spent the night in the boarding house, neither of them sleeping. Devlin sat by the window watching the street, and Faye lay curled on the bed, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. In the morning, they ate a silent breakfast and prepared to leave. Reeves met them at the door. I'll send word as soon as the judge makes his decision, he said. Devlin nodded. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. They climbed into the wagon and started the long ride home. Halfway there, as the sun began to set, Faye said, Devlin? Yeah? If the judge says I have to go, you'll come get me, right? Like you promised? Devlin looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and felt his chest tighten. I'll come get you, he said. No matter what. She nodded and leaned against his shoulder, and Devlin drove on into the gathering dark, his heart heavy with a promise he didn't know if he could keep. They reached the cabin just as night fell, the stars beginning to prick through the deep blue of twilight. Devlin unhitched the mule in silence, his movements mechanical, his mind still back in that courtroom watching Faye cry on the witness stand. When he came inside, he found her sitting at the table, her hands folded, staring at nothing. He hung his coat and hat, built up the fire, and put coffee on to boil. Neither of them spoke. The silence was different now, not comfortable, not companionable, but the silence of two people waiting for a blow they knew was coming. Finally, Faye said, "Do you think the judge will let me stay?" Devlin poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "I don't know. Mr. Reeves said we have a chance." "We do." "But you don't believe it." He looked at her, at the sharpness in her eyes, and realized she'd learned to read him too well. "I believe we told the truth. I believe the judge saw that. But the law don't always care about the truth, Faye. Sometimes it just cares about what's written down on paper." She nodded slowly. "My grandfather has more paper than you." "Yeah, he does." She looked down at her hands. "I don't want to go, Devlin. I don't care how much money he has or how big his house is. I don't want to leave." "I know. So what do we do?" Devlin set his cup down and leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "We wait. We hope. And if the judge rules against us, then we figure out what comes next." "What if there is no next?" "There's always a next, Faye. Always." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." That night, Devlin lay awake on his bedroll, listening to the sound of her breathing across the room. He thought about the hearing, about Ashby's cold composure, about Whitmore's sharp questions, and the way the judge had looked at Faye when she'd said she wanted to stay. He thought about promises he'd made and promises he didn't know how to keep. And he thought about what he'd do if the letter came, and the answer was no. He didn't sleep. The days crawled by like wounded animals. Devlin kept up the trap line, checked the snares, skinned what he caught, but his mind was never on the work. Faye moved through the cabin like a ghost, quiet and careful, as if she were afraid that speaking too loud might shatter whatever fragile hope they had left. On the third day, she came to him while he was splitting wood and said, "Can I help?" He looked at her, at the way she was twisting her hands in her apron, and realized she needed something to do, something to keep her mind from spinning in circles. "You can stack," he said. She nodded and set to work, gathering the split logs and stacking them in neat rows against the side of the cabin. They worked together in silence, the rhythm of the axe and the thud of wood the only sounds between them. When the sun began to set, Devlin set the axe down and wiped the sweat from his face. Faye was sitting on the woodpile, her knees drawn up, staring out at the trees. "You all right?" he asked. She shrugged. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather said, that he wants to know me, that he wants to give me a good life." Devlin sat down beside her. And I don't know if I believe him." "Why not?" "Because if he really wanted to know me, he would have tried before. He would have written to my daddy. He would have come to see us. But he didn't. He only showed up after we were gone." She looked at Devlin, her eyes dark and serious. "That's not love. That's guilt." Devlin nodded slowly. "You're right. So why does the law think he should get to keep me?" "Because the law thinks blood matters more than anything else. And maybe it does sometimes, but not always." "Do you think the judge knows that?" "I think the judge is trying to figure it out." Faye was quiet for a moment, then said, "If I have to go, will you write to me?" Devlin's throat tightened. "Faye, I know you promised you'd come get me. But if you can't, if the law won't let you, will you at least write?" He looked at her, at the hope and fear tangled together in her face, and felt something break inside him. "Yeah, Faye, I'll write." She nodded and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat there until the stars came out, and then they went inside. The letter arrived on the 6th day. Devlin was checking the snares near the creek when he heard the sound of hoofbeats. He straightened, his heart hammering, and saw the same young rider from before coming up the road. The man pulled his horse to a stop, reached into his satchel, and held out an envelope. "From Mr. Reeves," he said. Devlin took it, his hands shaking. "Thanks." The rider tipped his hat and rode off. Devlin stood there in the tall grass, staring at the envelope, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to open it. He thought about Faye inside the cabin, waiting, hoping. He thought about the judge's face, Ashby's calm voice, Whitmore's cold smile. Finally, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The words hit him like a fist. Mr. Merrick, I regret to inform you that Judge Hale has ruled in favor of Mr. Nathaniel Ashby. The court has determined that Mr. Ashby, as the child's closest living blood relative, has the legal right to custody. You are required to deliver Faye Bishop to Mr. Ashby's representative in Helena no later than October 25th. I am deeply sorry. We fought as hard as we could, but the law was not on our side. If you wish to appeal, we can discuss your options. But I must be honest with you, an appeal is expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed. My deepest condolences. Reeves Devlin read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He stood there for a long time, staring at the creek, listening to the sound of the water over the stones. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. Faye was at the table, mending a torn shirt. She looked up when he came in, saw his face, and went very still. "It's bad, isn't it?" she said. Devlin crossed the room and sat down across from her. "The judge ruled for your grandfather." Her face crumpled. "No." "I'm sorry, Faye." "But you promised—" "I know, and I meant it." He reached across the table and took her hands. "Listen to me. This ain't over. We can appeal. We can fight this." "But Mr. Reeves said—" "I don't care what Mr. Reeves said. I'm not giving up on you." Faye's eyes filled with tears. "When do I have to go?" "October 25th. That's 4 days from now." She pulled her hands free and stood, her voice rising. 4 days? That's all I get? Faye, I don't want to go, Devlin. I don't care what the judge says. I don't care about the law. I want to stay here, with you. Devlin stood and crossed to her, gripping her shoulders gently. I know, and I'm going to do everything I can to bring you back. But right now, we don't have a choice. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. There's always a choice. Not this time. She pulled away from him and ran outside. Devlin followed her to the edge of the clearing and found her standing in the tall grass, her arms wrapped around herself, sobbing. He didn't try to comfort her. He just stood there, a few feet away, and let her cry. When the sobs finally quieted, she turned to look at him, her face streaked with tears. I'm scared. I know. What if you can't get me back? Then I'll keep trying until I do. What if he won't let you? Devlin's voice was hard. Then I'll find a way anyway. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. Okay. Okay? I'll go. But only because you promised. Devlin nodded, his chest tight. That's all I'm asking. The next 3 days were the hardest of Devlin's life. He and Faye went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, checking the traps. But everything felt hollow, like they were play acting at a life that was already over. Faye barely spoke. She didn't cry again, but the light had gone out of her eyes, and Devlin felt its absence like a wound. On the night before they were set to leave, he sat at the table and counted out what money he had left. It wasn't much, barely enough for the trip to Helena and back, with nothing left over for an appeal. He'd have to sell pelts, maybe the mule, maybe the cabin itself, if it came to that. Faye came and sat beside him, watching him stack the coins. Is that enough? She asked. For now. What about later? I'll figure it out. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Devlin, if you can't afford to fight this, I don't want you to sell everything. I don't want you to lose your home because of me. He looked at her, at the worry etched into her small face, and felt something break open inside him. Faye, this cabin ain't a home without you in it. It's just 4 walls and a roof. You understand? She nodded, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. Good. Now get some sleep. We leave at first light. She went to her pallet and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Devlin stayed at the table, staring at the coins, and tried to figure out how to keep a promise he had no right to make. They reached Helena late in the afternoon on October 25th. The city was loud and crowded, full of wagons and shouting and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Devlin drove the wagon through the streets with Faye beside him, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. They found the address Reeves had given them, a large house on a quiet street with white columns and a manicured lawn. Devlin pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the gate and sat there for a moment, his hands tight on the reins. "This is it?" Faye asked. "This is it." She looked at the house, then at him. "I don't want to go in." "I know." "Can we just leave? Can we just go home and pretend this didn't happen?" Devlin's voice was rough. "No, Faye. We can't." She nodded, her face crumpling, and climbed down from the wagon. Devlin climbed down after her and took her hand. Together, they walked up the stone path to the front door. Devlin knocked. A moment later, the door opened and a stern-faced woman in a black dress looked down at them. "Yes?" "I'm Devlin Merrick. I'm here to deliver Faye Bishop." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Ashby is expecting you. Come in." She stepped aside and Devlin and Faye entered a wide hallway with polished floors and expensive paintings on the walls. The woman led them to a sitting room and gestured for them to wait. Faye sat on the edge of a velvet chair, her hands folded in her lap, and Devlin stood beside her, his hat in his hands. A few minutes later, Nathaniel Ashby entered the room. He looked older than he had in the courtroom, thinner, paler, his movements slower. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at Faye with an expression Devlin couldn't quite read. "Faye," he said quietly. Faye didn't answer. Ashby glanced at Devlin, then back at Faye. "I know this is difficult for you, but I want you to know that I intend to provide you with the best care possible. You'll have your own room, your own tutors, everything you need." Faye's voice was flat. "I don't want those things." "You may not now, but in time, I want to go home." Ashby's face tightened. "This is your home now." "No, it's not." Devlin stepped forward. "Mr. Ashby, can I have a word with you, alone?" Ashby studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Mrs. Calloway, please take Faye to her room." The stern-faced woman reappeared and held out her hand. "Come along, dear." Faye looked at Devlin, her eyes wide with panic. He crouched down and gripped her shoulders. "It's all right. I'll be right here. I'm not leaving yet." "Promise?" "Promise." She nodded and followed Mrs. Calloway out of the room. When they were alone, Ashby gestured to the chair. "Sit, Mr. Merrick." Devlin sat. Ashby poured himself a glass of brandy, then turned to face Devlin. "You have something to say?" "I do." "You don't want that girl." Ashby's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. You don't want her. You want control. You want an heir. You want to fix the mistake you made when you cut your son out of your life. But you don't want her." Ashby's voice was cold. "You don't know what I want. I know you didn't care about her when she was hungry and alone. I know you didn't care when her parents died. You only cared when it became convenient." "That's not true." Devlin stood, his voice rising. "Then prove it. Let her go. Let her come back with me. If you really love her, you'll do what's best for her, not what's best for you." Ashby's face hardened. "The court has spoken, Mr. Merrick. The law is on my side." "The law ain't always right." "Perhaps not. But it is the law." Ashby set his glass down and walked to the door. "You may see yourself out." Devlin's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This ain't over." "Yes, Mr. Merrick, it is." Devlin left the house, climbed into the wagon, and sat there for a long time, staring at the front door. He thought about going back inside, about taking Faye by the hand and running, but he knew it would only make things worse. Finally, he picked up the reins and drove away. The ride back to the cabin was the longest of Devlin's life. The wagon felt too light without Faye beside him, the silence too heavy. He thought about her face when Mrs. Calloway had led her away, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd looked back at him like she was afraid she'd never see him again. He thought about his promise, and he thought about how to keep it. When he reached the cabin, he unhitched the mule and went inside. The fire was cold, the table empty, the pallet by the hearth neatly folded. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space where Faye had been and felt the emptiness of it like a knife in his chest. He sat down at the table, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write. "Mr. Reeves, I need your help. I don't care what it costs. I don't care how long it takes. I'm not giving up on her. What do I need to do? Merrick." He sealed the letter, rode to Pinewood in the morning, and posted it. Then he went home and waited. The reply came a week later. Mr. Merrick, I've been asking around. There may be one option left, but it's a long shot. I've heard that Mr. Ashby is not in good health. If he were to pass, or if he were to voluntarily relinquish custody, the court would reconsider guardianship. I know that's not much, but it's all I have. In the meantime, I suggest you continue to gather support. Write to Faye. Let her know you haven't forgotten her. And if an opportunity arises, be ready to act. Reeves Devlin read the letter 3 times, then folded it and slipped it into his pocket. Not in good health. He thought about Ashby's pale face, his slow movements, the way his hands had trembled when he'd poured the brandy. And he thought about what might happen if Ashby didn't live long enough to see Faye grow up. It was a dark thought, and Devlin didn't let himself dwell on it. But it was there, a small flicker of hope in the midst of the darkness. He sat down at the table and began to write.
Dear Faye, I hope this letter finds you well. I know you're scared, and I know you want to come home. I want that too. But right now we have to be patient. I haven't forgotten you. I haven't given up, and I never will. Be strong. Be brave. And remember that you've got a home waiting for you when this is all over. Devlin. He folded the letter, sealed it, and posted it the next day. And then he waited. The weeks passed slowly. Devlin threw himself into his work, checking traps, curing pelts, chopping wood until his hands bled. He didn't sleep much. He didn't eat much. He just worked, because work kept him from thinking too hard about the empty cabin and the promises he'd made. In early November, a letter arrived from Faye. Devlin tore it open with shaking hands and read. Dear Devlin, thank you for writing. I miss you so much. The house is big and cold. My grandfather is nice, but he's always busy. Mrs. Calloway is strict. I have tutors, but I don't like them. They make me sit still for hours and learn things I don't care about. I think about the cabin every day. I think about the fire and the coffee and the way you taught me to bait a snare. I think about the creek and the trees and the way the stars looked at night. My grandfather says I'll get used to it here, but I don't want to get used to it. I want to come home. Please don't forget me. Faye Devlin read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box where he kept his most important things. A lock of Catherine's hair, a small wooden horse he'd carved for Lily, a photograph of his family taken the summer before they died, and now Faye's letter. He wrote back the same day. Dear Faye, I could never forget you. You're part of me now, same as my own daughters were, and I'm working on getting you back. It's taking longer than I wanted, but I'm not giving up. Be patient, be strong. And remember that no matter how big that house is, it's not your home. Your home is here, waiting for you. Devlin. He posted the letter and went back to waiting. In mid-November, Malcolm Reeves sent word that he'd filed a motion to revisit the custody arrangement, citing new evidence of Devlin's suitability as a guardian. The motion was denied. Devlin read the letter, crumpled it, and threw it into the fire. Then he sat down and wrote to Faye again. The letters became a lifeline. Faye wrote about her tutors, her grandfather's long silences, the way the house felt like a museum instead of a home. Devlin wrote about the trapline, the first snow, the way the cabin felt too quiet without her. He didn't tell her about the failed motion or the sleepless nights or the way he sometimes sat at the table and stared at her empty chair until the fire burned low. He just told her he was still fighting, and he was. Yet, on the morning of December 3rd, a telegram arrived from Helena. Devlin tore it open and read, Nathaniel Ashby, critically ill. Stop. Doctors say weeks at most. Stop. Will advise. Stop. Reeves. Devlin read it twice, then set it down carefully on the table. Weeks. He sat there for a long time, his mind racing. If Ashby died, the court would have to reconsider. If Ashby died, Faye would be an orphan again, and Devlin would have another chance. He hated himself for hoping, but he did. 3 days later, another telegram arrived. Ashby deceased, stop, left. Letter for court, stop. Hearing scheduled December 15th, stop, come immediately, stop, Reeves. Devlin stood in the doorway, the telegram in his hand, and felt the world tilt beneath him.
Ashby was dead, and Faye was coming home. Devlin stood in the cabin doorway with the telegram trembling in his hand, reading the words over and over until they burned into his mind. Ashby was dead. There would be another hearing. Faye might be coming home. He folded the telegram carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, and moved with sudden purpose. He grabbed his pack from the corner, stuffed in a change of clothes, checked the money he'd saved from selling pelts, and locked the cabin door behind him. Within the hour, he was on the road to Helena, the mule's hooves churning through the first real snow of winter. The ride took 2 days. Devlin barely stopped, pushing through the cold and the gathering darkness, his mind fixed on a single image. Faye's face when he'd left her at that house. The way she'd looked back at him with eyes full of trust he wasn't sure he deserved. He'd promised to bring her home. Now he had the chance to make good on that promise. When he reached Helena on the evening of December 5th, the city was draped in snow and lamplight. He went straight to Reeves's office and found the lawyer working late, papers scattered across his desk, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. Reeves looked up when Devlin entered, and something like relief crossed his face. "You made good time." "What's the situation?" Devlin asked, pulling off his gloves. Reeves gestured to the chair. "Sit. There's a lot to go over." Devlin sat. Reeves pulled a document from the stack and set it in front of him. Nathaniel Ashby died on December 1st. Heart failure. He'd been sick for months, apparently, but he kept it quiet. Before he died, he wrote a letter to the court. It was witnessed by his doctor and his attorney, so it's legally binding. Devlin's pulse quickened. "What did it say?" Reeves slid the letter across the desk. "Read it yourself." Devlin picked up the paper and read. "To the Honorable Judge Marcus Hale and the Territorial Court of Montana. I write this letter in sound mind and failing body, knowing that my time is short. I wish to address the matter of my granddaughter, Faye Bishop, and the custody arrangement currently in place. When I petitioned for custody, I believed I was acting in the child's best interest. I told myself, and the court, that I wanted to give her the life my son would have wanted for her. But in the weeks since she has been in my care, I have come to understand the truth. I did not seek custody out of love. I sought it out of guilt, pride, and a desire to control what little remains of my legacy. Faye is a bright, brave child, but she is not happy here. She does not belong in this house, surrounded by strangers and tutors and the trappings of wealth. She belongs in the mountains, with a man who took her in when no one else would, who gave her a home not because the law required it, but because it was the right thing to do. Mr. Devlin Merrick may not have money or influence, but he has something far more valuable. He has earned my granddaughter's trust and love. I saw that in the courtroom. I have seen it in the letters she writes to him, letters she hides under her pillow because she is afraid I will take them away. I was wrong to pursue custody. I was wrong to use the law to claim a child I had no right to claim. And I am writing this letter to correct that wrong. I formally withdraw my custody claim and request that the court grant full and permanent guardianship of Faye Bishop to Mr. Devlin Merrick, effective immediately upon my death. I ask that this be done without delay and that Faye be returned to the life she deserves. I leave the bulk of my estate to various charities and institutions. To Faye, I leave a trust fund to be held in her name until she reaches the age of 18 to be used for her education and welfare as she sees fit. Mr. Merrick will have no access to these funds unless Faye explicitly grants it, but I trust he will guide her wisely. I also leave her a small keepsake, a pocket watch that belonged to her father. It is all I have left of my son, and I hope it will help her remember that even broken families can find redemption. I die with many regrets, but I hope this letter will ensure that Faye Bishop is not one of them. Nathaniel Ashby. November 29th, 1880. Devlin set the letter down, his throat tight, and looked at Reeves. "This is real?" "It's real. Witness, notarized, legally binding. The hearing on the 15th is just a formality. Judge Hale will review the letter, hear any objections, which there won't be, and sign the guardianship papers. Faye is coming home, Devlin." Devlin leaned back in the chair, his hands shaking, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "When can I see her?" "The hearing is in 10 days. Until then, she's still technically in the custody of Ashby's estate, which means she's staying at the house with Mrs. Calloway. but I can arrange a visit if you'd like. I'd like. Reeves smiled faintly. I'll send word in the morning. In the meantime, get some rest. You look like hell. Devlin nodded and stood. Thank you, Malcolm. For everything. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when she's back in your wagon. Devlin left the office and found a room at the same boarding house where he and Faye had stayed before the first hearing. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to let himself believe that this was real, that the nightmare was almost over. But he didn't sleep. He just waited for morning. The visit was arranged for the following afternoon. Devlin rode to the house on the quiet street, his heart pounding, and knocked on the door. Mrs. Calloway answered, her expression softer than it had been the first time. Mr. Merrick, she said. Come in. Faye is in the sitting room. Devlin stepped inside, his hat in his hands, and followed her down the hall. When they reached the sitting room, Mrs. Calloway stepped aside, and Devlin saw Faye. She was sitting in the same velvet chair she'd sat in the day he'd left her, a book open in her lap, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She looked older somehow, more serious, as if the past 6 weeks had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Then she looked up and saw him. For a moment, she didn't move. She just stared, her eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe he was real. Then she dropped the book, scrambled out of the chair, and ran across the room. She threw her arms around him, her face pressed against his chest, and started to cry. Devlin knelt down and held her, his arms tight around her small frame, and felt his own eyes burn. It's all right, he said quietly. I'm here. I'm here. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her face wet with tears. Are you taking me home? Soon, real soon. How soon? 10 days. There's a hearing, and then you're coming home for good. She nodded, her hands gripping his coat. Promise? Promise. She hugged him again, and they stayed like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, until Mrs. Calloway cleared her throat gently from the doorway. I'll give you some privacy, she said, and left. Devlin stood and sat on the chair, and Faye climbed up beside him, her head against his shoulder. I missed you, she said. I missed you too. Did you get my letters? Everyone. And I kept them all. She smiled faintly. I kept yours too. Under my pillow, just like my grandfather said. Devlin's chest tightened. You read his letter? Mrs. Calloway showed it to me. After he died. Her voice was quiet. I didn't know he was that sick. He didn't tell me. Did you talk to him much? Sometimes, mostly at dinner. He asked me about school and what I was learning, but he never asked me if I was happy. She looked up at Devlin. You always asked me that. Because it mattered. I know. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm sorry he died. You are? A little. I think he was sad and lonely, and I think he wanted to be better, but he didn't know how. Devlin nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Do you think he meant what he said in the letter, about me belonging with you? I think he did. Faye leaned her head back against his shoulder. Good, because I do belong with you. Devlin wrapped an arm around her and held her close, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself believe that everything was going to be all right. Tolt. The next 10 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Devlin stayed in Helena, visiting Faye every afternoon and spending his evenings with Reeves, going over the details of the hearing. There wasn't much to prepare. Ashby's letter had settled the matter, but Reeves wanted to make sure there were no surprises. The estate executor might object, Reeves said one evening. He could argue that the trust fund gives Faye financial independence and that she'd be better off in a boarding school or with a professional guardian, but I don't think he will. Ashby's letter is pretty explicit and the executor seems inclined to honor it. What about Faye's aunt or Curtis Webb? Reeves shook his head. They haven't made a peep. My guess is they're happy to wash their hands of the whole thing. Devlin nodded, but he didn't relax. He wouldn't relax until the papers were signed and Faye was in the wagon beside him, heading home. On the morning of December 15th, Devlin dressed in his cleanest shirt, combed his hair, and walked to the courthouse with Reeves. Faye was already there, waiting in the hall with Mrs. Calloway. She was wearing a dark blue dress and polished shoes, and her hair was neatly braided. When she saw Devlin, she ran to him and took his hand. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm ready." They entered the courtroom together. It was the same room where the first hearing had been held, but this time it felt different, lighter, less oppressive. There were only a few people in the gallery: the estate executor, a clerk, and the same reporter with his notebook. Judge Hale entered, and everyone stood. "Be seated," Hale said, and they sat. Hale opened the folder on his desk and pulled out Ashby's letter. He read it silently, his expression unreadable, then set it down and looked out over the courtroom. "I've reviewed the letter written by Nathaniel Ashby before his death," Hale said. "I've also reviewed the testimony from the previous hearing and the affidavit submitted on behalf of Mr. Merrick. This court has a duty to act in the best interests of the child, and after careful consideration, I believe those interests are served by honoring Mr. Ashby's final wishes." He looked at Devlin. "Mr. Merrick, do you still wish to become Faye Bishop's legal guardian?" Devlin stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand the responsibilities that come with that guardianship?" "I do." Hale looked at Faye. "Miss Bishop, do you wish to remain in Mr. Merrick's care?" Faye stood, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, sir, more than anything." Hale nodded. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I hereby grant full and permanent guardianship of Faye Bishop to Devlin Merrick, effective immediately." He signed the document in front of him and looked up. "Congratulations, Mr. Merrick. She's yours." Devlin felt his knees go weak. He looked down at Faye, and she looked up at him, her eyes shining, and threw her arms around his waist. "We did it," she whispered. "Yeah," Devlin said, his voice rough. "We did." Reeves stood and shook Devlin's hand. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Malcolm, for everything." "It was my pleasure." The estate executor approached and handed Devlin a small wooden box. "This is from Mr. Ashby, for Faye." Devlin took the box and opened it. Inside was a gold pocket watch, engraved with the initials J.B., Joseph Bishop, Faye's father. He handed it to Faye. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this." Faye held the watch carefully, her fingers tracing the engraving. "It was my daddy's?" "It was." She looked up at Devlin, her eyes wet. "Can I keep it?" "Of course you can." She slipped the watch into her pocket and took his hand. "Can we go home now?" Devlin smiled. "Yeah, Faye. We can go home." They left Helena the next morning. Mrs. Calloway had packed Faye's things, her clothes, her books, the letters Devlin had written, and loaded them into the wagon. Faye said goodbye to Mrs. Calloway with a hug, climbed onto the wagon seat beside Devlin, and didn't look back. The ride home took 2 days. They talked some, but mostly they just rode in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that came from knowing you didn't have to fill every moment with words. Faye sat close to him, her shoulder brushing his, and every now and then she'd look up at him and smile, as if she needed to remind herself that this was real. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. Devlin pulled the wagon to a stop, helped Faye down, and opened the door. The cabin was cold and dark, but Devlin quickly built up the fire, and soon the room was warm and bright. Faye set her things down and looked around, her eyes taking in the table, the hearth, the pallet by the fire. "It's exactly the same," she said. "Did you think it would change?" "I don't know. I thought maybe it would feel different." "Does it?" She shook her head. "No. Feels like home." Devlin smiled and set a pot of coffee on the stove. While it brewed, Faye unpacked her things, carefully placing her books on the shelf and folding her clothes into the wooden chest Devlin had built for her. When she was done, she pulled out the pocket watch and set it on the table. "Devlin?" she said. "Yeah." "Do you think my daddy would be happy that I'm here with you?" Devlin looked at the watch, at the initials engraved on the case, and nodded. "Yeah, Faye, I think he would." She smiled and tucked the watch back into her pocket. That night after supper, they sat by the fire, and Faye asked Devlin to tell her about his daughters. He hesitated at first. He hadn't talked about Lily and Rose in years, but then he started, and the words came easier than he'd expected. He told her about Lily's stubbornness, about Rose's laugh, about the way Catherine used to hum while she cooked. He told her about the fever, about the helplessness he'd felt, about the years of silence that had followed. Faye listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she said, "Do you think they would have liked me?" Devlin's throat tightened. "I think they would have loved you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I wish I could have met them." "Me too." They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling between them, and Devlin realized that for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living, and he wasn't alone. Oh, the winter passed quietly. Devlin and Faye fell back into their old rhythm, checking traps, chopping wood, cooking simple meals by the fire. Faye returned to her lessons, and Devlin taught her to read the tracks of different animals, to tell the age of a tree by its rings, to navigate by the stars. She was a quick learner, and she never complained, even when the work was hard or the cold bit deep. In January, a letter arrived from Malcolm Reeves. It contained the details of Faye's trust fund, enough money to pay for her education and then some, held in a bank in St. Louis and accessible when she turned 18. Devlin read the letter, showed it to Faye, and then put it in the wooden box with the other important things. "You don't have to worry about that now," he said, "but when you're older, you can decide what you want to do with it." Faye nodded. "Can I use it to help you? If you need it?" "I don't need it, Faye, but thank you." She smiled. "Okay, but if you ever do, just ask." In February, they rode to Pinewood to buy supplies, and Mrs. Callahan greeted Faye with a hug and a peppermint stick. The whole town seemed to know the story, how Devlin had fought for her, how Ashby had written the letter, how the judge had ruled in their favor. People stopped them on the street to shake Devlin's hand and tell Faye how glad they were she was home. On the ride back, Faye said, "They like you." Devlin shrugged. "They like you?" "No, they like you. They think you're a good man." "Do you think I'm a good man?" She looked at him, her expression serious. "I think you're the best man I know." Devlin's chest tightened, and he nodded. "Thank you, Faye." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, the snow melted, the creek swelled, and the trees began to bud. Faye planted a small garden beside the cabin, the seeds she'd saved from the summer before, and tended it carefully, watering it every morning and pulling weeds every evening. One afternoon, as Devlin was splitting wood, Faye came to him with a handful of wildflowers. "Can we plant these by the graves?" she asked. Devlin looked at her, then at the flowers, and nodded. "Yeah, we can do that." Together they walked to the small clearing behind the cabin where Devlin had buried Catherine, Lily, and Rose. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, weathered by time and rain. Faye knelt down and planted the flowers carefully, pressing the soil down with her small hands. When she was done, she stood and looked at Devlin. "Do you talk to them?" "Sometimes." "Can I talk to them?" "Of course." Faye knelt again and said quietly, "Hi, I'm Faye. I didn't know you, but Devlin told me about you. He says you were kind and brave and that you would have liked me. I hope that's true. I hope you're not mad that I'm here. I'll take good care of him, I promise." She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and took Devlin's hand. They walked back to the cabin together, and Devlin felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked tight for years. Finally, letting go. That summer, Faye turned 9. Devlin baked a small cake, lopsided and slightly burnt but edible, and they ate it by the fire. Faye laughed at the shape of it, and Devlin laughed too. And for a moment, the cabin was filled with the kind of joy that had been missing for too long. In the fall, they made plans for winter. More firewood, more pelts, more supplies. Faye helped Devlin repair the roof and patch the gaps in the walls, and by the time the first snow fell, the cabin was snug and warm. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Faye said, "Devlin, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you think of me as your daughter?" Devlin looked at her, at the hope and fear tangled in her expression, and felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, Faye, I do." She smiled, her eyes bright. "Good. Because I think of you as my pa." Devlin pulled her close, his voice rough. "Then that's what I am." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the fire burned low, Two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and built a family from the wreckage of the past. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a home, and they were whole.